This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. If you like us, please join our community of supporters by giving to our Patreon campaign. Let me just say, please join our community of supporters. The Patreon campaign can be found on our homepage. I'm Dalia Shenlin, your hostess.
And I am Gilad Halpan, your co-host. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Today we have a guest who doesn't really fit our usual profile. She's not only an author, but a former politician and maybe a future one. Dr. Einat Wilf was a member of Knesset between 2010 and 2013 from the Israeli Labour Party and later for Independence Party formed by Ehud Barak. Dr. Wilf has a BA from Harvard University, an MBA and a PhD in political science from the University of Cambridge. She has written 6 books on various aspects of Israeli society and will be discussing mainly her latest one, The War of Return. It was co-authored by Adi Schwartz and it is about the Palestinian refugee issue. It's come out only in Hebrew so far, but soon it will be published in English as well. Einat Wilf, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, pleasure to be here.
Okay, so the obvious question, I think, is why now, right? The right of return has never seemed so irrelevant as it is in 2018, right? The Palestinians are divided and as weak as never before. Peace negotiations, repeatedly plagued by the refugee issue, are nowhere near resumption. And your book doesn't really read like a dispassionate academic essay, detailing all the genealogy of the refugee issue, but rather, does it have, do you think, any immediate policy implications for it?
Absolutely. The book, in many ways, challenges the very notion of what it means to be a peacemaker. For a very long time, we thought of peacemakers as diplomats shuttling between capitals, or negotiators, or lawyers. And the emphasis used to be on, let's get the people in the room. If we only get them in the room, let's butt heads. And I'm arguing that getting the people in the room is the very tail end of the peacemaking process. And that peacemakers should put aside the whole notion of shuttling and getting people into the room and focus on what are the core issues that are the main stumbling blocks to getting to peace and work very hard at removing those stumbling blocks. And our argument in the book is that the main and the least acknowledged obstacle to peace is the Palestinian demand to settle within Israel in its 67 lines, what they call the right of return, and without sustained international pressure to send a message to the Arab Palestinians that, first of all, there is no such right, that it doesn't exist, that they do not possess it, and that they need to begin to understand that the world is with them as long as their goal is an independent state in the West Bank and Gaza. But as long as they will continue to fight more than for a state, to fight for this idea of return, in that respect, they do not have the support of the world. And we increase the chances of making peace by focusing on this issue.
The only point I wanted to pick up on in Gilad's question was that it doesn't seem relevant now. And I agree, because there isn't much of a peace process, although your perspective on how there could be a more effective peace process is interesting, saying let's try to address the core issues before we get to the table so they don't mess everything up once we're there. But right of return is, in a way, very relevant. It is one of the most unifying features of Palestinian life. We see that it is a rallying cry around the Gaza demonstrations, but we also know that there's been lots of talk about it, that the negotiations are well known to have stumbled over it. It's been the subject of intense academic debates, the history of the refugee problem. You yourself write about Benny Morris's work, the campaigns by right-wing organizations like Im Tirtzu to debunk the Nakba myth. All of that is related. So why do you think it has been underappreciated?
One of the reasons that Adi and I went to write the book is because we felt that this is the biggest issue and the least understood. and the one that is the least acknowledged. We both came from the Israeli left. We both were euphoric during the 90s. We both were part of what was the central premise of the left for decades, which is land for peace. That we have a very simple equation that ever since 1967, Israel holds a simple equation for making peace: hand over land, get peace, simple. The Egypt agreement seemed to bear it out. I mean, we can argue whether what we have with Egypt should merit the title of peace, but fine. Oslo, Madrid, Jordan. So there was a sense for a while that this equation, this is math. And like many Israelis, beginning with Camp David in 2000, when basically this thesis collapsed and collapsed in a spectacular way, we made an assumption that the Palestinians are fighting for an independent state in the West Bank and Gaza, that they are a liberation movement for a people, not an annihilationist movement for a land. And when we realized that faced with concrete opportunity to have a state of their own in the West Bank and Gaza, they did not grab it with two hands, say a resounding yes. Me, Adi, and many other people in the Israeli left began to wonder, what is it that they want? And just like you said, through meetings with Palestinians, through readings, we realized that we got it wrong. And that this is indeed the deepest ethos. It is the most fundamental one. It is almost the one that defines what it means to be a Palestinian. To be a Palestinian is to believe in the right of the Palestinians to the entirety of the land. Palestine from the river to the sea will be free. And we realized that we have been deluding ourselves. We have been deluding ourselves, and this is something that I still find in discussing with Western diplomats, that this is a negotiating card, that this is something that will be given up as soon as other things are settled, that they know that they're not returning. I recently invented a word. I'm very proud of it. Everyone knows the word by now, mansplaining, right? When men explain what women should think or what they just said.
I sure hope they know.
Yes, and it's a good word.
At least they know what it means.
Thanks for telling us that,
and it is a good word, and it explains a true phenomena. So I coined a new word. I call it Westplaining. Westplaining is when Western diplomats and journalists explain away what Arab Palestinians have just said. And you see it all the time. You see it, you mentioned in Gaza. In Gaza, you have people demonstrating for return, marching for return. The names of the marches are not marches for independence, marches for removing the blockade, marches for more electricity. They're very clearly named marches for return. So during those marches, when they started a few months ago, a New York Times journalist did a video piece. And he interviewed those marching. And he asked them, what are you marching for? And they said, I'm from this village, mentioning a village within Israel. And I'm from that. And these are young people who were clearly born in Gaza, so they're not from those villages. So they would say, I'm from that, and I'm going to take it back, and I'm going to take this land, and this is going to be our land, and we're going to take it back. And after he interviews all the people, and they all say the same thing, he says, they are protesting the dire situation in Gaza. And I was thinking, did you listen to what they just said? And this phenomena of Westplaining away, when the Arabs are telling you very clearly what their purpose is, but everyone just said, oh, but they know it's not going to happen. They understand.
Well, it's not only Westerners who say that. Actually, it's Palestinians who say that. I'm sure you're aware of one of the most, great sort of historic moments in the history of polling in Israel-Palestine, when my colleague Khalil Shikaki conducted a poll in 2003 of Palestinian refugees in the diaspora in refugee camps, and he gave them all of the options that had been negotiated, including returning to a Palestinian state, settlement in a third country, and among those options was returning to inside the Green Line in Israel, and fewer than 10% of them chose it. This was not well received when he published that information. There was a protest, to say the least, but I mean, that is their own words, and that would justify the perspective of some people and the Western diplomats you cite, who maybe are getting this from Palestinians themselves, that they have a pragmatic approach to implementation of this right.
And also, can I add to that? There's also a disconnect between what the people say and what the leadership say. And we cannot ignore the fact that in 1988 and repeatedly since, the PLO, who are the recognized leading organization of the Palestinians, acknowledged the Green Line and recognized Israel. And by implication of recognizing Israel, it means that they cannot impose a return on Israel. So you can't hold it both ways, right? I mean, it's either you recognize Israel and its sovereignty and its decision to control its borders, or you don't. How do you place the attitude of the Palestinian leadership in all this?
So I'll take it together. When you use the phrase by implication, you are doing classic West-plaining. That is exactly what they haven't done. This is precisely, and we show it throughout the book, the Palestinian ethos, because the right of return is so deep. When Professor Shkaki did his poll, and indeed, you didn't even mention the extent, he is not touching this issue ever again, the kind of response that happened. Because he did a poll, he asked the questions in a very particular way. He did not ask the one question, do you agree to give up the right? And that is the one thing that you will not find a single person, or maybe if you find a single person, that person might not be alive anymore. You will not find a person who will say, we do not have this right. They will say, we have this right, it belongs to us, and we might or might not make use of it. But there is zero willingness to accept the notion that the right doesn't exist. So
we're going to get to that about whether it exists.
When there is recognition of Israel, and this has been the thing that really, in a way, gaslighted the Israeli left and much of the world, is we made those assumptions, like you said, by implication. Recognizing Israel means recognizing what Israel is, the nation state of the Jewish people, committed to being that state. Absolutely not.
No, just a sovereign country responsible for its own borders and population.
Those are our West-plaining assumptions, and they are very clear that the right of return stands. So when an Arab leader, and every Arab Palestinian leader ever has always stood by it, when they say we recognize Israel, we support the two-state solution, but then you ask them the right of return, that's holy. That's non-negotiable. That's an inalienable human right, which it's not. It's not in any conflict, in any situation. It's not a fundamental human right. It's not inalienable. It's none of those. But that's how they've come to believe it is. When they tell that story, the only two states they ever recognize are an Arab state in the West Bank and Gaza and an Arab state that will one day replace Israel. There has not been yet a fundamental acceptance among the Arab Palestinians, leadership or people, that of the principle of partition, that this land will be divided between a Jewish state and an Arab state as envisioned by the United Nations. That has not yet happened.
I'm curious about this question about the right. I mean, I think this is such a huge topic, but let's start with the fact that in your book, you go through a pretty thorough historical documentation of the creation of the refugee problem. You do. And you say in some cases it was people fleeing, in some cases it was expulsion, and you review Benny Morris's work. And they're claiming that as a result of these things, they have a right. You're saying they don't. But if you're accusing the Western discourse and the Israeli-Palestinian negotiation discourse as always focusing on implementation, how exactly it's implemented, is that so bad? I mean, in a way, it splits the difference, doesn't it? Explain to me why. I can see you shaking your head. But I mean, if the Palestinians insist they have a right, you say they do not. We may never agree on this, but we do agree that there is some shared responsibility for their fate. Maybe implementation, thinking about exactly what the limitations are, is the way to come to a compromise on it.
That would sound nice, but what we found out in the research is that, again, this is a classic case of willful blindness or West-plaining, because when Israeli peacemakers, people of the left, hear things like, okay, we'll recognize the right. Israelis, leftist Israelis, peacemakers, they think that's a past-looking thing. We think of it as it's a way to acknowledge the suffering, maybe the part that we played in the creation of the issue, but it's something for the past, and now we move to the future. What we saw in our research is from the Arab-Palestinian perspective, a recognition of the right is a future-looking thing. It's not about closing the past. It's about an Israeli recognition that this right stands. And as soon as this right stands from the Israeli perspective, from their perspective, it stands regardless. But if there is an Israeli acknowledgement that this right exists in the way that they conceive of it, inalienable, perpetual, belongs to every individual regardless of their citizenship, where they live, where they were born, you are handing the fate of the state of Israel to their goodwill. Because maybe right now, based on one poll 15 years ago, and again, we show that it was conducted in a way that was really skewed, but maybe
I'd have
right
to see
now
that argument to agree as a pollster because it really just reflected the negotiations.
But it was, again, in a way that really didn't touch the issue. It skirted around it. But a person holds the right now. Maybe right now they don't want to move into Israel, but the Arab world is not stable. Who knows what happens in 10 years? You do not end the conflict ever. And that's the key point. The conflict will never end if we agree that this right exists. Now, it's one thing for the Palestinians to believe in that. But our argument is that we need to make sure that it's only in their heads, that no one else believes in that.
But don't we? I mean, if you look at the balance of powers, Israel is by far more powerful than the Palestinians are and ever have been and probably will be in the foreseeable future. Israel has military might that Palestinians never had, or any or the Arab world put together. It has diplomatic support that the Palestinians never had in the shape of the American backing. So why don't we just separate the two issues? I don't know, the peace and perhaps a political settlement. Why can you not envisage a two-state solution where perhaps the Palestinians would hang on to this amorphous right of return, but at the same time will have their own state, will be done with the occupation, there will be a border to Israel and the state of Palestine. It will satisfy some on the Palestinian part, some on the Israeli part, the bulk of the international community, I'm assuming. It seems to me like it's an all-or-nothing approach, what you're suggesting here. Why not treat it incrementally?
Because this is the core issue. When you look at the power relations, it's exactly the opposite. When people say, oh, the Palestinians know they're not returning, it's a negotiating card. It's a very common view in the West. My answer is, among the two of us, they're the rational side. They're looking at the map and they're saying 7 million Jews living among 450 million Arabs, 1.2 billion Muslims. This is not going to last. And at the end of the day, this is the key issue. The Jews are a small minority in a broadly very hostile region that still has a dominant story in which these Jews are foreigners, that they are not a people who have come home, but they are people who get a variety of adjectives that all indicate they are foreigners. They are the French in Algeria, they are colonialists, they are crusaders, all ways to say they do not belong here, it's not their home, and they're temporary. The right of return is this idea that Israel, as the sovereign state of the Jewish people, is a temporary presence that sooner or later will disappear.
So it's up to Israel to make sure it won't happen.
That makes it sound like your actual claim is not even, that right of return is becoming a proxy, and that the real problem you have is that they have not recognized the Jewish historic connection to the region. Is that the case? I mean, because I think there's a lot to discuss in terms of the basic claim that the Palestinians do not have the right of return. You have a lot of arguments that I want to try to go through. But it sounds from what you're saying now like the bigger problem, what you consider their lack of recognition of Jewish historic connection and rights to this region. If that's the real problem, maybe that's what we should be focusing on.
So the right of return has become the most important element through which the core issue, which is indeed the deeper part of the continued denial that the Jewish people as a people, rather than as a religious group, that as a people and a nation have a legitimate, equal right to self-determination in the land. There's no doubt that this is the deep issue. The right of return has become the most obvious manifestation of this deep issue. And there's no doubt that we will get to peace only when there is, over time, a willingness to recognize that the Jews are indeed an indigenous people who have come home rather than a bunch of foreigners.
So let me ask you the obvious question, because there's a real critique here of the idea that refugee status for Palestinians is passed down over the generations. And it's a point that you've made repeatedly. And how can we argue exactly what you're saying now, that I, Dalia, who moved here without a single Israeli ancestor from the U.S., have more rights to be here than a Palestinian who left their homes in living memory with just a couple generations ago? Why, if we recognize that right for ourselves as Jews, this ancestral sense of being people exiled from our land, how can we then refuse to even recognize the theoretical right for Palestinians, regardless of how it's implemented for now?
So this is where we need to understand how the right of return of Palestinians was conceived. In the Zionist context, the issue of coming to the land was subservient to achieving sovereignty, which is why there was never an element of it has to be every specific part, and it was never about also denial of other rights. The Palestinian right of return was never innocent. And this is something that's very difficult for people to appreciate, because many people go with the emotional element of people have a connection, they just want to return home, they've been expelled, they have feelings. That's all true, but it was true for Indians and Pakistanis and Germans and the Sudeten and Turks and Greeks and Armenians.
We're going to get to all of those. We're going to get to them, believe me.
Yeah, for everyone. But they all had feelings, they all had memories. But it was very clear that a collective demand for return is equivalent to reopening war. This is why nowhere was there this idea that return is a right, because return was considered in international relations as equivalent to reopening war. And indeed, this is the case here. During the war, initially it appeared that the Jews would lose. There was that moment. Those who fled thought they would return as victors. It seemed reasonable. Within a few months, the tide turned, and it seemed that Israel would stand, that the Jews would be able to gain independence. During that time, people who have fled earlier want to return. At that moment, look, these are feelings, they want to go home. The Arab leadership makes it very clear that no one returns. Suddenly they're against the return, this personal, emotional thing. Why? Because at that particular moment during the war, the return was considered to be legitimizing Israel. Later, when the war was over and there was ceasefire, return suddenly became a way to say, you know what? We may have lost the battle to prevent immigration. During the 20s and 30s, we may have lost a diplomatic battle against partition. We may have lost the war to prevent Israel's establishment. But that doesn't mean that the war is over. And this became the key way to say the war is not over. And how do we see it? Jordan, which was the only country willing to make peace with Israel at the time, as I'm sure you know, the Hashemites always had a more positive view of Zionism even since World War I. They were willing to make the ceasefire lines full borders, partition, an India-Pakistan situation. They were the only ones who didn't demand return. They made citizens of all the Arabs who fled, and the Jews who were forced out of the West Bank also became citizens of Israel, and the idea was that this would be the situation. India, Pakistan. Of course, this is why Abdallah was murdered. And ever since, the Jordanians have been very iffy on the issue. But you see that the one country that wanted to make peace did not demand return, and the countries that refused to make peace, such as Syria and Lebanon and Egypt, were the ones who insisted on it.
So as you say in the book, and you document it at length, Israel understood that return means annihilation pretty early on. And since the late 40s, even in the early 50s, they were adamantly opposed to it for the same reasons that you mentioned now. But if you look at it, perhaps in a broader scale, it was, in a way, say that they had allowed all the refugees to return, it would be, in a way, just a return to status quo ante, right? Because according to the partition plan that the Zionist leadership accepted, there would be a substantial Palestinian minority within the Jewish state that would, there's a demographic play here with aliyah as opposed to procreation, but there would be just a significant hostile minority within the Jewish state either way. So what changed within these 2 years? Why did they accept that in 1947 and flipped 2 years later to think that this would be just completely unacceptable?
The war.
No, but hostilities didn't start in 1948.
No, but in 1947 there was a partition plan which Israel celebrated and accepted, and even though it was not thrilled about it, the Zionist movement was denied Zion, the Judean people were denied Judea. It was not thrilled about it. Most of the land was a desert, and yet it said yes because it assumed sovereignty, and it knew that even though there would be a substantial Arab minority, there would be enough immigration to compensate for it. And it said yes. And if the Arabs had said yes, no one would have been displaced. There would have been an Arab state. They could have called it Palestine or anything they wanted, and no one would have moved. But after 2 years of a declared annihilationist war, the notion that you can just go back, in many ways, this is almost a thing that is still brought to Israel. Like, okay, we tried to annihilate you. We're sorry that we failed, but why don't we go back to before we tried to annihilate
I think what you're trying to say is there was an evolution of understanding of the political realities on both sides during the war and to some extent after the war. I want to get back to really the arguments you make for why there is no such right, because there's a number of them here. And I want to start with, the idea that people don't return. I think what distinguishes the Palestinians here is a number of things from the cases that you cited, the first one being statelessness. Now, they're not stateless everywhere, but where they are stateless, that is a great distinction from the people that you mentioned who have been moved in population exchanges. I mean, the Greece and Bulgaria or Greece and Turkey. For one thing, those people were repatriated to their own ethnic kin states and then fully patriated. This is not the case for Palestinians. So that is a distinction. And the other issue that I have is the claim that return doesn't happen. It absolutely does happen. You yourself point out, for other reasons, the case of former Yugoslavia and the Kosovo War. The vast 90% of the refugees from Kosovo came back, and Bosnia people have been repatriated back to their original country, if not necessarily their actual homes. And then we'll talk about some of the other distinctions. But what about those two factors? The fact that Palestinians are stateless, many of them, and that return does happen as a precedent and is upheld by UN security resolutions and human rights organizations. So how do you deal with that?
So, of course, this is one that Arabs and Palestinians conveniently like to ignore. They behave as if the Palestinians are refugees because they have no state. It's exactly the opposite. In their refusal to have a state in half of the land, because from their perspective, any Jewish state is unacceptable in any size. In their violent refusal to have their own state, which they entirely could have had, and in taking active part in the war to prevent the establishment of the other state, they became refugees. So, first of all, it's reversed. That's a key element. The other part is where they fled was entirely to where they are of their ethnic kin. There is no difference.
But they're not the same people. Sure, there's a difference. Ask Palestinians how they feel in Lebanon.
Oh, but that is after. What is amazing, we can go country by country, but as I'm sure you know, for many years, this region was called Southern Syria. And then there was no consideration that there is any ethnic difference. In Jordan, there is clearly none. And even in Lebanon, one of the reasons that the refugee definition for Palestinians is so bizarre and odd, only requiring 2 years of residence in the land rather than actually being in the land your entire life, is that many of them were seasonal workers from Lebanon. But those who came back and were exactly of the same ethnic group, because from that moment on, Arab countries decided to separate this group in order to make it clear that the war is not over, people who were unfortunate to be seasonal workers and then just fled 10 kilometers north suddenly became different people. But this is because the context is different, but it's not different than any other country. They went to where they are of the same ethnic group, the same language. Other countries agreed to absorb. Here, the Arab countries refused because they wanted to keep alive the message that the war is not over. And again, Jordan made them citizens, absorbed them, willing to end the war. But it is the Arabs themselves who refused that and continued to keep alive and murdered Abdallah precisely because he was willing to accept
Sure,
them.
I mean, but the fate of refugees can never depend on forcing another country to offer full citizenship to those refugees, and I think that probably many Palestinians would dispute the sense that they're all the same people. But let me ask you another question that is a main argument of the book that disputes why there is a right of return for such a large number of refugees. One of the major claims you have is that many of them are not refugees at all, but internally displaced people, because they didn't cross an international border. The Green Line is not internationally recognized. Many of them went to Gaza and the West Bank. And you say, well, they're IDPs, internally displaced people. However, internally displaced people are absolutely recognized by international humanitarian law, customary international humanitarian law, as having the right to return to their homes as well. So why does this diminish the claims?
So again, that's also to your previous question that I didn't finish. The idea of return, you brought one single example from the 90s. But this is a conflict that happened in the 40s. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, and the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and 80s, the clear, dominant international ethos was that return, and certainly minority return, doesn't happen. And they don't care why. If the country at the end of the war says, I don't want to take back the minority that fled, it is not forced to do so. And
minority being not to the country, to their own nation state, so to another nation state.
That they are the minority in the country to which they are demanding return. So return does not happen, and it is not a right. Now, the idea is that if return can happen, great. But and typically the returns, the ones you mentioned, are majority returns. Majority returns happens.
It depends on how you look at Kosovo, because Serbia still thinks that Kosovo is a part of Serbia.
Kosovo is
yet
the
the
only
Albanians
example,
return.
and it comes from the 90s. The 90s were a moment where the international relations changed a bit, mostly because Europe had some interests. And even then, if you look at the people, those who returned were the majority. And in the groups where they are the minority, we've looked at it very carefully, it actually doesn't happen. Physically, they're not returning because of opposition. It is considered, even today, when we have changed a bit our views, something that you do not do. We bring an example from Bhutan, from Nepal. It's not done.
3.4 million Tutsis returned to Rwanda from 1959 onward. It's not only in the 90s. I mean, in other words, it does happen.
It happens when it can happen. But it is not a right. There is a very big difference. The Palestinians have come to conceive of it as some fundamental superior human right that trumps everything else. It's not. It's the kind of thing that if it can happen, it can happen. But if there are other considerations, it doesn't happen. We think of a human right as something that is superior to other considerations. That's how the Arab Palestinians want us to think about the right of return. What we're making clear is that return is not a right, not even for internally displaced persons, certainly not for their descendants.
But why should the Palestinians be treated differently from those other populations? And by the way, most of these conventions,
they're not treated
most
differently.
of these conventions have nothing to do with the Palestinians. They emerged with relation to resettlement of IDPs in Abkhazia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Philippines, Tajikistan, Afghanistan. I mean, these are places that had nothing to do with the Palestinians, where the right of IDPs to return to their homes was upheld by international humanitarian law, customary, and through UN resolutions. So why should they, I mean, from their perspective, why should they be treated differently from all those people?
They're not treated differently. Again, first of all, we need to remember context. This is the thing. We have a people who have decided to send a message that the war against a sovereign Jewish state is not over decades. During the 40s and 50s, they are the ones that are treated specially. They are the ones that are not subject to the international norm, which is people do not return if it's not possible. And that the international community, after several years, when it sees that it's not possible, it certainly does not sustain them in some ongoing, decades-long limbo that says, oh, but you will return one day. After a few years, it says, sorry, but let's look for other solutions. And other solutions are considered equally legitimate. And that's critical because, again, there's a tendency to present the Palestinian right of return as the only legitimate solution. Resettlement in other countries. All of these things are equally legitimate.
And they have all been part of two-state negotiations.
No, but it already means that they're not refugees. Citizens of Jordan, a Palestinian who's a citizen of Jordan, born in Jordan, 82% of them don't even live in camps. The camps are not camps. A wealthy businessman living in Amman is by no international standard a refugee from Palestine. It is a unique situation that only the Palestinians possess, and it should not exist. A middle-class lawyer living in Ramallah under the Palestinian Authority, born in Ramallah, never displaced an inch, is not a refugee from Palestine.
Okay, Gilad's going to kill me if I don't let him get a question in edgewise, but I do have one last question about this. It sounds like what we're saying, all the things you're talking about, all these other alternatives have been discussed in the two-state negotiations. Now, it would be a different book to find out why they failed. Certainly this was part of it. But if those issues have been negotiated, and on the technical level we've got those options of third country and, patriation of a Palestinian state and some limited number returning to Israel, my question is, it seems like the two sides can come to a meeting point through these very technical aspects. Are we really not talking about a symbolic acknowledgement of each other's narrative? In other words, you are concerned about the bigger problem from your perspective, that the Palestinians have not recognized the Jewish connection to this region, which is ancient and historic, much more than it is modern. And the Palestinians, aren't they really saying also that they want an acknowledgement of what they went through, of their situation and their dispersion, their diaspora all over the world for the last many decades? I mean, couldn't we make some progress and generate some goodwill by symbolically acknowledging what the other's been through?
So again, I'm sorry to repeat it, but this is a form of West-plaining. We can all acknowledge each other's suffering, the extent to which we made each other miserable. That's all fine. There's a huge difference.
But we haven't.
I'm saying we can do that. This is not what we're discussing. It's a huge difference between that and the demand that Israel recognize that there is such a thing as a right of return. And throughout the negotiations, not for a single moment, have the Arab Palestinians ever agreed to any kind of phrasing that would end the story. And I think we all agree that we want to know that when we come out of that negotiating room, the conflict is over for good, that there is no demands on Israel within the 67 line, that the war is over. We want to know that the war is over. And what we are opening people's eyes, because we know there's a desire for willful blindness. I quote Shimon Peres in the book, who said that to make love and peace, you need to do it with your eyes half closed. I don't know how people make love, but I think for peace, it's been a disaster. We need to do it with our eyes fully open. We can recognize narratives, we can recognize suffering, but the moment that people speak of rights, and they speak of possessing those rights, and refuse to have any phrasing that says that they will stop possessing those rights, and they demand that I, as Israel, recognize that they forever can hold the sword over me, then the conflict is not over. And if we negotiate peace, and that's the thing, I want the word peace to mean something. And it means that the conflict is over. And as long as there is any acknowledgement that there is such a thing as a right of return into pre-67 Israel, the conflict is not over.
So wasn't Zionism just a beautiful endeavor that was set up to fail? Because in a way, they never accepted the Zionist narrative. They don't still now. more than 100 years on, and it doesn't look like they will down the line. And the flip side of West-plaining is going to the international community and tell them, you tell the Palestinians what to think about the right of return. I see really a stalemate here that, we cannot bypass. How do you see the future? Is there any way out of this mess?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, I'm not telling the Palestinians what to think. The Jews will never deny their connection to Judea, even when we renounce any territorial ambitions there. But it's not going to be because we say that we do not have a connection. And I'm not asking the Palestinians to deny their love for the entirety of Palestine and their memories and their desires. We're talking about legal issues. We're talking about rights. And just as Israel will have to renounce its right to settle in ancestral Judea, this is what I expect from the other side. Now, I'm not getting into their heads, but I do want the international community to remove any fuel that it gives to this idea. People have no problem with the international community telling Jews not to settle in Judea, right? Certainly, I think it's a great idea. You might think it's a great idea. I think it's good that we hear morning, noon, and night that we cannot have the entirety of the land. And this had a lot of impact. The Arab Palestinians hear from no one the simple message that says, guys, enough. You will not have all of it. It will not happen. It doesn't exist. You can dream of it, but it's not a right. Now, how does it all end? I have a talk. You're welcome to go to YouTube. I have a talk. I love giving it. It's called What is the Conflict About and How Will It End? I go through my own personal process. And I said at the end, the conflict ends in one of two ways. And it's not the one state, two state. Those are details. It's this. Either they win or we win. Now, what does it look like if they win? I mean, the conflict ends. Not really for all. What does it mean if they win? They win is they massacre us, throw us into the sea, whatever they say they're going to do, turn us into a small, Jewish, powerless minority that knows its place as a religious minority.
Wait, who says that? Who says they're going to do that? They're going to massacre us and throw us into the sea? I haven't heard that since like 1930.
You're welcome to read, again, as I said, open eyes. You're welcome to read the narrative that we do not belong here, that we're crusaders, that we're colonialists, that the resistance, that we do not belong.
Most of the time I'm reading polls and they're saying they want to end occupation.
I
want to hear the end.
Let me just
I want to hear it as well.
Yeah, how do we win?
In that context, but we need to understand, in that context, return makes sense. The Arab Palestinians are the vanguard of this resistance. It makes perfect sense. How do we win? Given the numerical ratio, we do not massacre them, throw them into the sea, and turn them into a minority that knows its proper place. The ratio of Jews to Arabs when Israel declared independence was 1:50, and with all the immigration and procreation, today the ratio is 1:60. We're a tiny minority in the region. We win when the Arab world finally accepts us as part of their story. That is the moment when they change their story to make the idea of the Jewish presence here, rather than a foreign humiliation, something that was part of Islam, part of the Arab history. I'm about to give a talk in London this week, and I'm going to talk about the role of Christian Zionism and the support for Zionism, and I'm going to talk about the role that I believe one day Islamic Zionism will play in making peace. There is nothing to prevent a change in the story. These are stories that we tell ourselves. But in order to begin the changing of the story, we need to understand that this is where we need to head, not just practical issues. A lot of people tell me, can't we just deal with the practical issues, leave the grand stories aside? That will take time. My takeaway from decades of negotiations is that you do not reach practical solutions if you do not change the story. And the story of Israel and the Jewish people belonging here is the story that ultimately will lead to peace.
I mean, I agree with you because I'm a big believer in the grand narrative of politics driving much of our policy and the symbolic aspects too. And so I guess my final question would be, don't we have to meet each other halfway? Doesn't Israel have a story to tell itself as well?
Yeah, what happens if neither side
I mean, no, I guess the real question is, does it have to be such
we have now.
Right. I mean, does it have to be such a categorical, it's we win or they win, or we win or we lose? is there a meeting point of these stories? Do we have some work we can do and they have some work on the narrative part, and that we can meet part of the way, which may facilitate getting to a better technical solution?
The question is, what do you call the narrative? If you ask a simple question, do the Jews belong here or not, there's no halfway meeting place. Either the story is that they don't belong here, or the story is that they do belong here.
I think from their perspective, the question of meeting them halfway would be acknowledging Israel's role, even if partial, in the creation of the Palestinian refugee issue.
I would argue that's not an issue at all. That is easy. That is easy in the context. We can all acknowledge that. But the big story is the simple one. Fundamentally, is the Arab and Islamic world willing to acknowledge the Jews as an indigenous people who belong here, or as foreigners who should be resisted and out? And in this, there's no midpoint. And this thing has to be settled one way or another for the conflict to be resolved. You're right that until that point, this is what we have in the meantime. But the conflict is resolved in the deep sense of the word only once one of these stories plays itself out.
Well, I guess we can all sadly acknowledge and agree that we have a long way to go before this conflict is resolved. Dr. Einat Wilf, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
And a big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. Now, a request. Many or most of you listen to us on Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review. Then you actually have to write one. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. We've got gifts and perks for you. They're really cool. Check it out. And also look at our archive with almost 500 interviews. If you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. The Tel Aviv Review podcast Ideas from Israel is the name of our page. And follow us on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.